Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 14, Jean Baptiste Jourdan, Marshal.
Among the recruits who enlisted in the Auxerrois Regiment in 1778 was the son of the local doctor of Limoges, Jean Baptiste Jourdan. But 16 years old, having been born on April 29, 1762, Jean Baptiste was attracted to the service by the desire to see America and to aid in the good cause against perfide Albion. Returning to France in 1784, with all hopes of gaining a commission dashed to the ground by Séguiè's ordinance, which excluded from commissioned rank all but those of noble birth, Jourdan took his discharge. The ex-sergeant married a marchand de mode and set up a small drapery shop, but so humble was this venture that the future marshal had to carry his stock in a valise on his back and trudge from fair to fair to peddle his wares. As he went from village to village, he retold his adventures and fired his listeners with the account of the glorious freedom of the New World, comparing it with the miserable restrictions which had driven from the army himself and many another fine soldier. When in the autumn of 1791 there came the call for volunteers, Jean Baptiste gladly left his counter and enlisted in the battalion of the Upper Vienne. His experience and ability soon marked him out for command, and he was chosen by his comrades as lieutenant colonel. The opportunity he had long dreamed of had at last arrived, and he made the most of it. Methodical and industrious, with the lessons of handling and equipping irregulars which he had had in America, he made his battalion a pattern for the others, and was complimented by Lafayette on the admirable condition of his command. Serving under Dumouriez in the invasion of Belgium, he was present at Jemappes, and there proved that, in addition to powers of organization, he possessed the capacity for leading in the field. Promotion came speedily when the guillotine cleared the way in the higher ranks by removing the incompetent and unfortunate. By May 1793, he had gained the grade of General of Brigade. 2 months later, he became General of Division. His first opportunity of distinguishing himself in high command came 6 weeks later, when he was entrusted by Houchard with the command of the advance guard in the operations which ended in driving the English from the siege of Dunkirk. So well did he execute his orders at the Battle of Handschutten that Carnot selected him to succeed his commander when Houchard was hurried off to the guillotine for failing to reap the full fruits of victory. Jourdan was fortunate in that Carnot, the organizer of victory, was responsible for the welfare of the French arms, and not the despicable Bouchotte. Carnot had grasped the fact that, if you are to defeat your enemy, you must bring superior moral and physical force against him at the decisive spot. Thanks therefore to him, Jourdan was able to mass superior weight and at Maubeuge hurl himself on the scattered forces of the enemy who were covering the siege of Valenciennes. But the victory of Maubeuge nearly cost him his head, as that of Handschutten had done for his predecessor. The Committee of Public Safety, with that incompetent rashness which those who know least of war most readily believe to be military wisdom, ordered him to pursue the enemy and conquer Belgium. It was in vain that he pointed out the strength of the Allies, his want of transport and stores, and the difficulty of undertaking a winter campaign with raw troops. Reason was of no avail. His resignation was wrathfully accepted, and he was ordered to Paris to give an account of his actions. Face to face with the committee, the general renewed his arguments, explained how the old battalions of regulars had dwindled down to some 200 muskets apiece, how the new levies possessed neither arms nor clothing, how some battalions were armed with pikes, some merely with cudgels, and finished by offering, as a proof of his zeal for the Republic, to go to La Vendée and fight against the rebels. The truth of his statement and his obvious disinterestedness won the day, and though for the moment he was refused a new command, his life was saved. Moreover, the Committee of Safety profited by his advice, and during the winter, the Army of the North was reclothed and equipped. Thanks partly to his suggestion, the battalions of the line were brigaded with the volunteers, and this reorganization produced the magnificent regiments which Napoleon found to hand when he commenced his career in Italy. Jourdan's time of inactivity was but short. He had proved his worth in the field, and France needed every capable soldier. Moreover, he had made open testimony of his republicanism in the Jacobin Club, swearing before the tribune that the sword which he wore should only be unsheathed to oppose tyrants and defend the rights of the people. So in March 1794, he was sent to take command of a new army which Carnot had been raising during the winter. By June, this new force of 100,000, known to history as the famous Army of the Sambre and Meuse, had established itself on the Meuse and taken Charleroi. Coburg, the commander-in-chief of the Allies, anxious about his communications, hurried to oppose this successful advance, and on June 25th was fought the Battle of Fleurus, which caused the Allies to evacuate France, ended the Reign of Terror, and was the starting point for the long period of offensive warfare, which was at last brought to an end 21 years later on the field of Waterloo. At Fleurus, Jourdan proved his ability as a tactician, and the victory was due to the moral courage with which he threw his last reserve into the fray. Backed by the Army of the North under Pichegru, he then swept over Belgium, and by the autumn, the Republican armies had crossed the Rhine. During the next year, Jourdan was engaged in the Rhine Valley, but in 1796 he was ordered to advance through the Black Forest on Ratisbon, and there join another French army under Murat, which was moving down the right bank of the Danube. Against this defective strategy, he protested in vain, and as he had expected, was driven back by the able measures of the Austrian general, the Archduke Charles. After this misfortune, he was placed on the unemployed list, and, for some time, had to find an outlet for his energies in the field of politics. Entering the Council of 500 as the representative of the Upper Vienne, he was warmly received by the Republican Party, and voted against the proposed re-establishment of the Catholic religion, and supported the coup d'état of the 18th Fructidor, by which the royalist councillors were driven into exile. Full of fiery zeal for the Republic, a rhetorical speaker ready to appeal to the gallery, swearing on his sabre the oath of fidelity, he nevertheless had a cool head for business, and it was at his suggestion that in September 1798 the celebrated law was passed whereby conscription became the sole method of recruiting for the army. Jourdan introduced the law with a flourish of trumpets, assuring the council that, in agreeing to it, they had decreed the power of the Republic to be imperishable, while as a matter of fact, they were forging the weapon which was to place their country at the mercy of the first adventurer who had the courage and capacity to make himself dictator. In 1799, foreign danger once again caused him to be entrusted with a military command, and once again he was opposed by his old adversary, the Archduke Charles, and driven back in retreat across the Rhine. Thereon, the Directory superseded him by MASSÉNA, and he returned to the Council of 500 and in September proposed his memorable resolution that the country is in danger. Italy under the yoke, the barbarians of the north at our very barriers, Holland invaded, the fleet treacherously given up, Helvetia ravaged, bands of royalists indulging in every excess, the Republicans proscribed under the name of terrorists and Jacobins. Such were the outlines of his picture. One more reverse on our frontier, he added, and the alarm bell of royalty will ring over the whole surface of France. But France had had enough of the terror and knew that she could evolve her safety by other means than that of the guillotine. 6 weeks later, Bonaparte returned from Egypt. From the advent of the consulate, a blight fell over Jourdan's career. Napoleon could never forgive him for the obstinacy with which he had opposed him on the 18th Brumaire. True, in 1800 he appointed him governor of Piedmont, and in 1804 created him marshal. He could not withhold the baton from the general who had in 1794 driven the enemy from the sacred soil of France, who, more often than any other general, had commanded in chief the armies of the Republic, and who, in spite of numerous defeats, had established a reputation as one of the most brilliant of the generals of Republican France. But though he gave him his baton, Napoleon thought but little of his military ability, and called him a poor general, for in his eyes success, and success alone, was the test of merit, and he could see nothing in a general who, from his capacity for emerging with credit from defeat, was surnamed the Anvil. But it was not this which caused Napoleon to snub the gallant marshal. It was his ardent republicanism and well-known Jacobin sentiments which made him so hateful to the emperor. But though Napoleon treated him shamefully and did all he could to cast him into ill repute, the marshal showed he had a soul above mere personal ambitions and served France faithfully. At St. Helena, the fallen emperor confessed, "I certainly used that man very ill. He is a true patriot, and that is the answer to many things urged against him." From 1805 to 1815, Jourdan's life was full of mortification. When the war broke out against Austria in 1805, he was in command of the army in Italy, but was at once superseded under the plea that his health was bad and that he did not know the theater of war like MASSÉNA. However cleverly the pill was gilded, the marshal knew that it was the emperor's distrust which had lost him the command. But, though Napoleon disliked him, Joseph was his friend, and in 1806, the new king of Naples applied to be allowed to take him with him to Italy as his major general and chief of the staff. When in 1808, Joseph exchanged the crown of Naples for that of Spain, the marshal accompanied him, and when in 1809, Napoleon hurriedly left Spain to return to Paris, he appointed him chief of the staff to King Joseph. The major general's task was a difficult one. He had no executive authority. His duty was simply to give advice to the king and to transmit such orders as he received. But unfortunately, neither Joseph nor he had the power to enforce orders once given, for although certain French corps had been placed at the disposal of the king and were supposed to obey his orders, their commanders had still to communicate with Berthier and to receive through him the decrees of the emperor. Hence there was a dual authority, and to make matters worse, Napoleon did not attempt to veil his contempt of Joseph's military ability. At the same time, he cast aspersions on Jourdan's skill and showed his open dislike to the marshal by omitting his name from the list of French marshals in the almanac, under the pretense that he had been transferred to the Spanish establishment and was no longer a Frenchman. Consequently, the other marshals paid but little attention to the king or the major general. At the Battle of Talavera, Jourdan's advice was utterly disregarded and his orders entirely neglected, and still he had to bear the blame and endure the whole of Napoleon's wrath. In despair, broken down in health, he applied to be relieved of his duties and returned home to private life. But in 1812, when the emperor was summoning his vast army for the invasion of Russia, being short of officers, he sent the marshal back to his old post in Spain. The task had been a hard one in 1809. It was harder still in 1812. The flower of the French troops were now withdrawn for the Russian campaign. The authority of the king was more feeble than ever, and years of warfare had transformed the English army into a perfect fighting machine. The Spaniards were now past masters in guerrilla warfare, while the iniquitous scheme of making war support war had subverted discipline and broken the morale of the French army. With admirable lucidity, the marshal drew up a memoir showing the state of affairs in Spain and pointing out what was at fault. But memoirs written for Joseph could not alter evils which flowed directly from Napoleon's having broken the golden canon of the unity of command. With three practically independent commanders-in-chief who refused to acknowledge the controlling authority of the king, who were too jealous of each other to work with mutual accord, disaster was bound to follow. The temporary cooperation of all three drove the English back on Portugal at the end of 1812. But in 1813, the disaster in Russia had caused the emperor to make further heavy drafts on the force in Spain. Jourdan could only advise a steady retirement towards France. The culminating blow at Vittoria was no fault of his. Struck down by a fever the day before the action, he was unable to give his advice at the critical moment. So Joseph had to fight Vittoria without the assistance of the chief of his staff, and with subordinates who not only despised but disobeyed him in the presence of the enemy. It was no wonder that defeat easily turned into rout. The whole of the French baggage was captured, and in the flight the marshal had the misfortune to lose his baton, which was picked up by the 87th Regiment and sent to England. After 1813, Jourdan's career came to a close. Napoleon heaped reproaches on him and refused him further employment. entirely oblivious of the fact that it was he himself who was responsible for the Spanish disaster, and that the Marshal had done all that was possible. On the emperor's abdication, the old Jacobin took the oath of allegiance to King Louis and remained true to his allegiance during the 100 Days. Time had chastened and mellowed his fiery republicanism, and seeing that a republic was impossible, he preferred the chance of constitutional liberty under a monarchy to the tyranny of the empire. In 1817, as a reward for his services, he was created a peer of France. But though he accepted the Restoration in preference to the empire, all his sympathies were liberal, and no one had a greater dislike for the reactionary policy of Charles X. In 1830, he gladly accepted the new liberal constitution of Louis Philippe, the old Philippe Égalité of the days of Jean. The new monarch appointed his former comrade governor of the Hospital of the Invalides, and there, among his old fellow soldiers of the Revolutionary Wars, the Marshal breathed his last on November 23, 1833, in his 72nd year.
This concludes Chapter 14 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 15 about Charles Augereau. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.